sense of motor. I thought before we read, maybe I'll tell you what we'll do. First we'll drink some water there. Hare Krishna, how are you doing?
Great to see you.
Good to see you. Krishna Krishna. Before we start reading the Krishna book, I thought I'd give a little more history since you seemed to enjoy hearing history yesterday. Okay. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurn Miditam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadav Mayham Tadhati Shapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Jatapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Shahagana Raganatan Vitam Stam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Shahagana Lulita Sri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kam Shana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Prishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Vodi Priye Vanshakol Pitarubhyascha Kripa Sindho Bhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Yes, I thought we could speak more about the history of putting together the Krishna book. First of all, I think I sold short yesterday my godbrother, Hayagriva Prabhu, and his contributions as editor. He was, in fact, expert. He was a very good writer. He wrote a book, Hare Krishna Explosion, and maybe something more also. And editorially, his skills were quite refined. He edited the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the original Bhagavad Gita as it is, second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, and the first volume of, the first of the two volumes, originally two volumes, of the Krishna book. And I learned most of, well, not most, but I learned much of what I learned about editing by following the example of Hayagriva Prabhu. I would see how he did things, and I would copy his approach. And later, when I began editing, he would go over my stuff and make some corrections, and so I would learn from that. So we're all, and there was really no one else then who could have done what he did. No one else had the skills. So it was Krishna's arrangement that such a talented devotee was there to assist Srila Prabhupada in putting together these early works. Now, as you know, the first volume was of Krishna book. Originally it was 2 volumes in this rather oversized format. And the Prabhupada's original idea was that Krishna's pastimes in Vrindavan would be the first volume, and his pastimes in Dwarka, Mathura and Dwarka, would be the second volume. And there were little chapter ornaments, I guess you would say, little illustrations that went at the top of each chapter. One illustration for the Vrindavan pastimes and another illustration for the Mathura and Dwarka pastimes. The first volume, as I recall, had a picture of Radha and Krishna, and the second had the picture of Dwarkadish. All the pictures were personally guided and approved by Srila Prabhupada. The artists, as you might remember from yesterday, were located in Boston. We're working under Radharani Devi. Hayagriva was working from Columbus, Ohio, where he was on the faculty of Ohio State University. And the rest of us, well, Satsvarup Maharaj was the original transcriber from Prabhupada's tapes. Prabhupada would send him the tapes in Boston, and he would transcribe them. And then Hayagriva, Satsvarup Maharaj would do a first editing, as I recall. And then Hayagriva would do the second editing. The production crew was in New York at what was then called ISKCON Press, which was located in, now let me get this right, had we moved there yet? No, we hadn't moved there yet. Where were we working from? Were we working from 61 2nd Avenue? I've forgotten exactly where we were located, but we finally moved up to Boston we were located in New York, of course, and then we moved up to Boston. The method of book production then was quite different than it is now. Now we do everything on a little desktop, a laptop, a desktop, any kind of computer is enough to do everything you want to do. Back then, everything was more specialized. It started, of course, with Srila Prabhupada and his dictating machine. At first, for the Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada had personally done the typing with 2 fingers on an ordinary typewriter. But early on, And Gargamuni had seen in the window of a store a Grundig dictating machine. And he thought that, well, maybe this is something Swamiji could use for his writing his books. So he went into the store and bought it. And the salesman showed him how it worked and how to do everything and so on. Then he brought it to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada at once accepted it. And Gargamuni began to show him how to use it, but Prabhupada, he said, knew right off how to use it. So from there on, things changed. Prabhupada went from personally typing his books to dictating on this what he called a dictaphone. A dictaphone is a trademark for a particular brand. This was a Grundig dictating machine, essentially a dictaphone. And it was like a reel-to-reel recorder. It had these tapes that would last, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that, if that. And later, the company went from reel-to-reel tapes to cassettes. The cassette was just a tape in a container. It was nothing really changed. And Prabhupada had just a small number of these, maybe 5 or 7, and he would use them again and again, and just record over what he'd already dictated. And he would, want to keep like a close control. I have 3, you have 2, and so on. So they would always be coming back to him. So Prabhupada had one machine. The machine that you see in the videos or in photographs is a shinier, more modern version than the one Prabhupada used for the Krishna book. That was an older version that essentially did the same thing. And it had a little button that you could click to record or to stop or to rewind. And so Prabhupada would click. I think you've seen on the videos. He'd click and speak and click and speak. And then he'd send the tape off to Satsvarup Maharaj. The tapes to send it, he would use an old used envelope. He'd just turn it inside out and staple it, as I recall, and put the address on. Didn't want to spend money on envelopes. And he would put a little sticker on it with the number of the tape, Krishna book, chapter 47 or whatever, which we collected back then, those little stickers. We had in Boston the same machines, same type of machine that Prabhupada had, and so we would transcribe the tapes. Satsvarup Maharaj was the original transcriber, as I mentioned. I also did a fair amount of the transcribing once I came to Boston. Narayani Devi, who's here in Vrindavan, was one of the transcribers. I think Isha Dasi, a few of us got in there and transcribed the tapes. Transcribing was sometimes difficult. You had, of course, there you had a foot pedal. So you'd sit at your desk, and with the foot pedal you could stop and start and reverse and so on. And you had what was essentially a stethoscope sort of a thing, a little to hear with. Although we someplace had a fancier set of earphones that we'd use to listen to something that was difficult. The tapes were not an easy job to transcribe because, Prabhupada spoke in heavily accented English, which itself was difficult. Sometimes you didn't know whether he was speaking English or Sanskrit. So you'd have to orient yourself. It wasn't always clear. Sometimes he'd be using unfamiliar Sanskrit words. And also, by the nature of the stopping and clicking, sometimes words would be cut short. And so or they'd sort of, they'd seem stretched or mostly cut short. That's really what they were cut short. And so sometimes there was a fair amount of guesswork. You'd have to play it and play it back and play it back and play it back until you thought you'd got it. And so we transcribed them, means we typed them on typewriters with a carbon copy. Do you know what carbon copies are? There was a sheet of what was, you have on your email a CC, carbon copy. Now it's a digital carbon copy. But back then, there was something called carbon paper, which was a sheet of plastic, really. I don't think it was paper. And on one side of it, there'd be a kind of carbon-like substance. And you'd put that sheet between two sheets of paper, and so that the keys of the typewriter, after hitting the first sheet of paper, would also hit the carbon paper, and the shape of the letter would be transferred onto the sheet behind it. And so that sheet behind it would be a carbon copy. So now you know what CC means in your email program. And you could do it, you could have two carbon copies, and the second one would be more faint than the first one. You couldn't really go beyond an original and two copies. You wouldn't have enough force. So we'd make an original and a carbon copy using typewriters. And sometimes if we made mistakes, we'd just type an X through them. If a word was wrong, we just type XXX through it and go on. And we'd type double space so that the editors could get in there and do their editorial work with old-fashioned pens. There were a lot of what's called mondegreens. You don't know what a mondegreen is. It's a word coined by an American 20th century writer who, as a child, her favorite ballad Scottish ballad was, I forget the name of it, but it was about Lord somebody or other who was killed, and the song said they killed poor Lord such and such and Lady Mondegreen. So she'd been very fond of this ballad, although she didn't know who Lady Mondegreen was. Later she found out that what the ballad actually said was that they'd killed poor Lord such and such and laid him on the green. The green being the lawn, essentially. So she coined this word mondegreen, which means a word that you hear that's plausible but wrong. There were many mondegreens in the Krishna book, some of them only lately discovered in the last few years. One of them was a place where the book said that Dwarka was fortified by cannons. And one of the translators wondered about that. It seemed like something archaic, an anachronism. You know, back in Dwarka, you wouldn't have expected cannons. So we had copies of the tapes. Jadharani, our original artist, would take the tapes that Prabhupada sent, and she would put the speaker of the dictaphone next to a microphone from a tape recorder, and sometimes tape them together and make copies of the Prabhupada's dictation. That's why we have copies of some of the tapes of Krishna Book. Otherwise, Prabhupada didn't care about copying them. He just wanted to use them, use the tapes and get them back. But she made copies, and you can still hear those recordings today. So the BBT staff went back and listened to that section about Dwarka and found out that Prabhupada had said that Dwarka was surrounded by canals, which of course is canals, so not by cannons. Another place it mentioned that there were, among other paraphernalia, I forget whether this was in Hastinapur or elsewhere, there were many horse heads. And it turned out that these were horse sheds. A third instance is that it was said somewhere that, I think in the section concerning the Shamantak jewel, that once in, again, it may have been Dwarka, there was, no, not Dwarka, this, once in the city of Kashi, within the barricades of Varanasi, there was a shortage of rain, there were droughts. This is a problem because where's Kashi within the barricades of Varanasi? What's the problem?
It's the same.
Yeah, they're the same. Kashi and Varanasi are the same place. Kashi, Benares, Varanasi, they're all names for the same city. So once within the city of Kashi, within the barricades of Varanasi, there was a shortage of rain. So again, they went back to the tape and they found that what Srila Prabhupada said, Okay. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. What Srila Prabhupada had said was once in the city of Kashi, within brackets, Varanasi. So these are called mondegreens. Plausible but mistaken hearings. So there were mondegreens and other such problems. But anyway, the tapes got transcribed. Then they would be edited, first by Satsrup Maharaj and then by Hayagriva. And then they would be edited for Sanskrit by Pradumna. And then they would be typeset. The first typesetting machine was purchased by Hayagriva Prabhu. His wife Shamadasi was the first typesetter. Back then, typesetting was mostly done on linotype machines, which were big monstrous machines that set type using molten metal and gave you slugs of type, which were then assembled in a, what do you call them? Kind of a, there's a technical name for it. I never used this stuff, but it would be assembled on a page. Then it was called linotype because it produced all the type in a line, and then the next line of type and the next line. You would assemble all these lines and sort of, what's the word? Pack them all together.
Collate?
No, not collate. You just set them one upon another, and then you had sort of you tuck them in essentially with brackets, and then the image, the typeset page would then be impressed upon a sheet of paper, and that would be photographed, and that the photograph would be a mechanical photograph, a big sheet of film, which came out as black and white, black with clear letters, and that would be exposed onto a printing plate, and then your printing plate would go on your press, and that's how things were done. That later came to be called hot type because the type was hot. But right around the time that we began, in the years when we began Krishna book, something came in called cold type. Cold type was a different process. The IBM company, International Business Machines, came out with a machine that could do typesetting. It would look like a somewhat oversized typewriter. It had no electronics whatsoever. It was electric, but it had no logic, electronic logic, no circuit boards with digital anything, entirely mechanical. And it was ingenious. Actually, at that time, most typewriters, and you've probably never seen one of these things, they had, you hit a key and this bar would come up with an A or a B or a C. And you would type as fast as you can and it would boom. And often you'd type too fast and two bars would join and you'd have to pull them apart. And IBM came out with something called the IBM Selectric typewriter, which had what came to be known as a golf ball on it. Instead of those bars, it had a little golf ball, and according to which key you hit, a certain the golf ball had like 3 rows of letters on it, and it had little teeth on the bottom, so that the mechanism could catch the ball and place the letter you wanted in the right spot. And so this ball would spin around and put your letters there. And it became the ubiquitous equipment in all the corporate offices in New York City, and all the secretaries were using IBM Selectric typewriters with great happiness because they were much better than the previous technology. But IBM also came out with something they called the Selectric Composer. Selectric Composer used similar golf balls, although somewhat different. And the glory of the machine was that it could, do 2 things. They could mix typefaces. So you had a choice of this face or that face, Roman, italic, bold, Times Roman, or today it would be Caledonia or, what have you. And you could justify the columns. You could make the columns even, which was a hallmark of every book worthy of its name. The columns would be even, whereas just typewriting, has ragged edges. So the Selectric Composer could do all that. And so Hayagriva Prabhu bought one. They cost $5,000, which was a pretty penny back in 1970. And his wife learned to use it. And I won't tell you exactly all that went into it, but you would have to type each line twice. Once you typed the line, and you'd take a sort of a reading. It would show you a number and a color, and you would tab over and type what like a B5, blue 5. And then you would go and set the same line again, but this time you would set a dial to B and another dial to 5, and the machine would insert the requisite amount of space so that all the lines would come out even. And so each line was set twice. If you had a narrow column, you could just tab over and type it again. But in our case, we had larger, so we would just have pages of these first pass typings with the codes on the right, and then we would go back and type the same pages again. When you typed it again, there were other things you had to do. You could have as many typefaces as you want, but only one at a time. So every time you wanted to change, say from Roman to italic, you would take out the golf ball and put a different golf ball in. Which for the word-for-word meetings was a lot of fun. But the fun is only getting started. The real fun was the diacritical marks. Diacritical marks, those balls only had a certain number of spots on them. It wasn't unlimited like now. You have Unicode, which accommodates thousands of letters, thousands of glyphs, as they're called, symbols. But you got I forget how many, basically enough to cover the lowercase and uppercase letters and the usual punctuation marks. That's what would fit. But we needed dots under the D's, dots under the T's, dots under the H's, long I's, long A's, long U's, R's with dots under them, M's with dots over them, N's with dots over them, R's with dots under them and long marks over them, L's with dots under them. And I don't know if I'm missing anything, but that's what we needed. So to get anything, you had to sacrifice an existing character. So we would sacrifice, characters rarely used, like a pound sign, and or an at sign, and we'd put a diacritic mark in there instead. Some of them were a combination of the letter and the mark. The I was like that because you couldn't have a dot sticking up in the middle of your diacritic mark by sticking a diacritic mark over a regular I. So we had one spot that was for the lowercase I with a make run, a long mark over it. But if we did that for all the letters, we'd be in trouble. So we had one dot that we would use under the D's and the H's and the R's and the G's. Another long mark that we'd use over the A's and the U's, and so on. So you have the dots, you have the long marks, you have the I's, each of these taking up a space on the font. And the R's were a particular difficulty, and they'd be centered, of course. They'd be arranged in such a way that the dot would be in the center of the letter. The R, however, does not go in the center of the letter because the visual center of the letter is actually on the left, right? You have the stem of the R with an overhanging shape, arch there. So your dot has to be left. But we couldn't afford another dot. And so for doing the dots, there was something called a dead key. You would hit a key that said, okay, we're going to hit this letter, but we're not going to advance. We're going to stay where we are. And then we're going to put a dot. So that worked fine. You'd put like a D and you wouldn't go anywhere, and you'd put your dot, and then you'd move on. But for the R, you did something like dead key, 2 units back, dot, 2 units forward, something like that. You would have to manually specify how you wanted to do those, where you wanted to put the dot, and then you could move on. So that's how that's what the composers were dealing with. Those dots were only available from one company. There was one company in the world, as far as I remember. They were located in Honolulu, and their business was modifying IBM golf balls. And they didn't do it cheap. They were expensive little deals. But we needed them. We bought them. But one for italic, one for Roman, one for bold. But the teeth would break. By constant use, the teeth on the IBM golf ball would sometimes break. And then you would have trouble getting, the machine couldn't find your characters. It could find some of them and not all of them. So then we would replace the golf ball. But sometimes it just was too much. The golf ball would break, the tooth would break. But you'd say, well, we can still use it for this character, and this character, but not for that character, and that character. So you'd have essentially 2 golf balls that you'd have to go back and forth with just for, Times Roman. So that was another feature. Anyway, I could tell you more of the technical details, but that's how it would be done. Oh, and for your final pass, when you put it through the composing machine, you would do it on a thick kind of paper. You just use scrap paper for the first one. For the second one, they had this paper made with a kind of clay that made it thick, so that when you hit your character on the paper, it would be the impression would be crisp. So we would do that. It was costly also. And then when your page was done, you would spray it with a fixative, a chemical, like varnish practically, which was toxic and stinky. So we would have devotees sticking their arms out the window and spraying the page, summer, winter, or in between. What else about that? Oh, and then it would go through a correction cycle, of course. The editing itself went through a couple of cycles. Then after it was typeset, there'd be Sanskrit proofreading, there'd be English proofreading, there'd be errors detected. The typist would have to retype the line or the paragraph. And sometimes they'd generate new errors, and there'd be a second cycle of proofreading, and they'd do it again. And at the end, all of these pages, galleys, no pages, you could call them galleys. They'd be assembled on what was called a light box. There were commercial light boxes, but we made our own. You had like a little wooden frame with a fluorescent light, and then on top of that would be frosted glass, a surface of frosted glass. On top of that would be a sheet of thin cardboard or thick paper with faint blue lines on it that showed where the page number would go, where the lines of type would go, and so on. And then you'd paste up this. You'd spray the back of the pages with rubber cement and fix them on these mechanicals. We had a name for them, flats, I think we call them. Anyway, you fix them on these mechanicals using the blue lines as your guide for where to put them. There were devotees his job was doing that layout. And then you'd have to proofread again to see that they got the right things in the right order, and they would have to paste in the corrections. And it would get messy with all this rubber cement and so on. Later we got what was called a waxing machine, which would put a coat of wax on the back of the page, corrugated wax, and the corrugations would stick to what you wanted to stick the page onto. And it was easier because you could pull it up and put it down, and pull it up and put it down, and it wasn't messy like rubber cement. So we got a machine that did that for us. But you would have to put in the corrections by hand. There was something called an X-Acto knife, with which you would cut the pages so you could stick them in. And then a line of corrections, and sometimes it got so bad we would just correct one word and paste it on top. And at the end, when it got really bad, we would take what was called a rapidograph, a fine point pen, essentially, and just carefully draw in a diacritic mark, we can't. So that was layout, proofreading. Then, as I mentioned, the finished pages would be shot, they'd be photographed, and then there'd be opaquing, because the photographic process was imperfect. So you'd get white letters on a solid black background, but the solid black would sometimes have holes in it. And so you'd have to fill the holes with an opaquing solution, which would be a dull red stuff. Sometimes the letters also would need a little fixing. So opaquing, that was another process. Then the pages would be put in a certain order so that when you folded the sheets of the printed pages, they'd come out in the proper sequence. And then we would ship it off. We would shoot those pages, and those were the pages we'd shoot, and then send that all off to Japan. All of this, of course, to save money, and also because it was highly technical to get somebody else to edit professionally that kind of work, or to do that kind of typesetting, to lay this all out would have been way beyond what we could have done. So all the devotees at what was then called ISKCON Press were engaged in that service. We would go out for an hour a day and on kirtan every day, and the rest of the time, and the morning program, evening program, and then the rest of the time we were busy at ISKCON Press. I should also mention one further thing. We ran the typesetting equipment around the clock. as I mentioned, that was a $5,000 machine. And we couldn't just buy 5 of them. So the one machine that we had, we ran 24 hours a day. I'd spent a summer with the American Merchant Marine, just sort of as a deckhand on a ship. And they had shifts, 4 hours on and 8 hours off. So you'd work, say, 12 to 4, midnight to 4, and then noon to 4. And the rest of the time was off. So 8 hours off, 4 hours on. It's also called split shifts. So they'd have 3, someone 12 to 4, someone 4 to 8, someone 8 to 12. So we instituted that system for the typesetting. Our typesetters were Balai Dasi at different times. Balai Dasi, Palika Dasi, Mamata Dasi, Mahamaya Dasi, and a few others also. Ragatmika Dasi, and so on. So they were doing that work. They would get up and do the midnight shift from 12 to 4 or someone. And they'd go to Mangal Arti, and then they'd crash. And similarly, someone would come to relieve them at 4 in the morning. So we were running these machines around the clock. No one did that. A typical New York typesetting company, you start at 9 and you close at 5, and that's how they did it. But we worked from 24 hours. And as a consequence, the machines were always breaking down. We started with 1, we eventually got 2, and maybe even 3. And in Boston, by the way, we had 2 in Boston, I think. 1 was in the basement. So I remember Palika Dasi in the winter, from 12 to 4 and 12 a.m. to 4 in the bitter Boston winters, wearing gloves and typing Prabhupada's books. So these machines were breaking like anything. They'd work and they'd break. And IBM was making a lot of money on what they called service contracts. They'd lease you the machine, and then they'd have a contract. They'd come to your place and fix your machine, and you paid a fixed sum, and that's how all the offices did that. And that's what we did also. We had a service contract, but in our case, the service guys were coming every 2 days, every 3 days, twice a day. As soon as they would leave, it would break again. And it was exasperating. I remember at one point, the guy in charge of the local IBM office was, he's really cross with us because we were always calling him, and we were so demanding, and we had to have this and we had to have that fixed. And it was, he was gruff, and we were dissatisfied. And I looked through the New York phone book. We weren't getting what we needed. I looked through the phone book, and IBM, and they had like a column and a half of numbers for IBM, all the various different departments. I found something that looked like it was relevant, and I called them up. I got this voice that sounded like it was from Satyaloka. Really? Well, that shouldn't be happening. That's not what you should expect from IBM. It sounded like I was talking to somebody on floor 64 of the Pan Am building or something, from a paneled office. The next day, the manager and 3 tech guys were at our place, giving us a brand new machine, falling all over themselves and apologies. And when we finally retired that machine, because I think they were leased, the IBM guys came and took them away. I remember one guy said, this machine doesn't owe you anything. In New York, we did this work from the second story, space in a warehouse space on a street called Tiffany Place, which sounds very upper class, but really was sort of just near the dock area, near the East River, and full of thieves and all sorts of people. So we would have devotees who would sleep up there every night. It was called loft watch. If it was your turn for loft watch, you slept in the loft and kept the thieves on notice that you were there. So these were some of the conditions under which the devotees worked, first in New York and then in Boston, and then again from Boston, everything came down to New York. I think we didn't have all that equipment at first when we were in New York, but in Boston we did, and then it moved to New York with us. Printing was done by Dinapan. I think you've read that story in Prabhupada Lilamrita, how Prabhupada negotiated with the Dinapan company. And another feature of the proofreading, which was one of the steps, proofreading really means to make sure that your manuscript matches your final product. And the way that you would do that is you'd have one person reading and another person listening. And you would read out all your punctuation. Once in the city of Varanasi, Kama, there was a shortage of rain, period, and so on. You read it that way. And but one day we wanted to see how university presses were doing things. So Radha Ballava, our press manager at the time, went to Princeton University Press to see how they were doing everything. And he saw how they were doing everything. But one girl came up to him and said, "Can I speak with you?" And somehow she'd gotten a book or something, and she was very interested, and she wound up joining us. Her name was Dukahantri Dasi. She was also one of the composers. And so it was a profitable expedition. And from them we learned the technique that instead of having two people sitting, one reading, one listening, you could dictate a tape, and then the hearer could just listen to the tape, so you didn't have to have two people sitting there at the same time. So we adopted that system. And that's probably about it for today, about production. Dinapan was the printer. And of course, we had no idea how to distribute books. We would just get them and try to distribute book here, try to distribute the book there, until the devotees on the west coast of America found out that they could distribute large numbers of books. They distributed 20 books in a day or something, which was enormous. And that's a separate history, which has been recorded, I think. You can read about that. Any questions? These are another kind of Krishna book pastime, the pastimes of putting together the book. Yes.
Raj, one thing I wanted to hear is, because you mentioned you were basically working non-stop and you had morning and evening program. What were they actually? What was your...
Morning program was not much different from today's morning program. Mangal Arati, Japa, Tulsi worship, Nishringa prayers, Guru Puja. I think
There was Narsimha prayers at that time?
Yeah, Nishringa prayers from the day I joined. The Nishringa prayers were there. We didn't sing them; we spoke them responsively in Sanskrit. Nobody knew the tune back then. But yeah, Nishringa prayers, they were originally introduced as being a prayer for Srila Prabhupada's health. As you recall, he'd gone back to India after a heart attack. But we kept those prayers. Then there'd be a Bhagavatam class, perhaps not quite as sophisticated as today. And we didn't have responsive chanting and all of that. It was just somebody would read the text and give a kind of a talk about it. And prasadam. There were no... Yes, we had deities. The deity, and greeting of the deities was there. These things were sort of just being introduced then. Nectar of devotion was teaching us how to worship the deities and so on. That hadn't come out. So we were in a very embryonic stage. But our morning program was like that. Our evening program would be Arti Kirtan and a class again, Bhagavad Gita. And the kirtans were fantastic. Kirtans back in those days were great. Simple and one tune throughout, easy to follow, Kartal's Mridanga, enthusiasm. All Hare Krishna. And especially, as time went on, we got really expert kirtaniyas like Bharadraj and Jai Sachinandan and others. The devotees would race to be there. The kirtans would be so enlivening and wonderful. The devotees would all want to take part. And the press workers especially were very enthusiastic in their sadhana. That's what kept the press going. Very enthusiastic in morning program, evening program, hearing, chanting. And as I said, an hour a day of going out on the kirtan party also.
So how was that? For 1 hour everybody was going to?
We would jump in a van, go out for an hour, jump in a van, and come back. And the result was that we got so much more done. It's not that we lost an hour, we gained 3. Nothing like purifying your heart for an hour on the streets of New York City to make you more productive and happy. Yes.
So in philosophy, they have this example of a ship, and then they are asking if you every time change a part of that ship, you change the wood, at what point does the original ship cease to exist and a new ship is made? So similarly with the books of Prabhupada, if all these small changes come throughout the years, now they have the hermeneutics seminars and all of these to discuss, how can we be sure that we stay true to what Prabhupada gave?
Well, of course, this is a long topic with which I'm not directly involved anymore. But first thing is, I think the total changes made in, first of all, the places where most of the changes are is in the Krishna book. and Bhagavad Gita as it is, because those were the earliest books done from tapes, especially. Bhagavad Gita, not entirely from tapes. Ishopanishad was totally typed by Prabhupada, so it was easier to work with. Bhagavatam first and second cantos were totally typed by Prabhupada. But Bhagavad Gita and Krishna book were done from dictation. And Nectar Devotion also. So that's where you'll find most of the revisions. Once you get to fourth canto, fifth canto, sixth canto, seventh canto, it's much less. Prabhupada's traveling with his own Sanskrit editor. Sanskrit editor is much more experienced by now. The devotees who are typing know Devanagari, and she's traveling with Prabhupada, Pradyumna's wife. If there are questions, they can ask Prabhupada on the spot. So as you go along in the later history of the books, there's much less uncertainty or many fewer errors. But in the early days, you have this dictation. You have editors who are less experienced. We're not as familiar with the philosophy. We haven't read we don't have the benefit of having read beyond first canto and the Macmillan abridged Bhagavad Gita. So we're not, and TLC, so we're not that familiar with what's going on. And various other problems. You weren't as expert in hearing Prabhupada, and you're just making out what words he's using. So you have many more errors in those early books. But still, I think the total number of revisions, you hear these shocking figures like 5,000 revisions, which includes things like commas. And that comes to, in an 800-page book, someone can do the math or take out your iPhone calculator. But how many corrections is that on a page? 3, 5. When you include punctuation, it's not quite as shocking as one might think. I think the total number of revisions, or the total number of revisions winds up showing you that the book was revised by not more than 3%, 5%. I think that's the number Dravida Prabhu, our present chief editor, has given, which means not a whole heck of a lot. The editorial philosophy of the BBT is to keep the books as close to Srila Prabhupada's intention as possible. That places limits on what you can do. You can't just say, well, I like it more like this, or I like it more like that, or I think this would be a better meaning than that, or I disagree with Prabhupada about that. It has to be the overarching idea is to bring it closer to what Prabhupada said. That's the standard editorial model followed among academics who are in the field of what's called textual scholarship. Textual scholarship is a specialized field, and it's a discipline, and there are do's and don'ts. There's ways to do things and ways not to do things, and they do this for authors like Hemingway, Mark Twain. You name him, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and on and on and on. Most, to say nothing of Shakespeare and other texts. So it's a discipline in which the purpose is really the opposite of, the purpose is to see that the author's intentions are there on the page. And when you find out, and there are various ways in which it can be something other than what he intended. An editor could have speculated and speculated wrong. A word could have been misheard. A word could have been mistyped. A typist's eye might have skipped from line 6 to line 8. That's a common error. And various other ways that things can go wrong. So the BBT has tried to see to it that the publications match what Prabhupada intended. It requires a certain amount of faith, that is to say, if you think your editors are a batch of screwballs or demons or people who are just off the rails, then you're probably really going to be in fear about what could happen to the books. And if you have faith that they know what they're doing, you'll probably be undisturbed in your sleep by such things. The BBT has now put a review board in place to sort of double check the work of the editors. And you have also a large readership that sort of serves to check what's been done. The large readership is largely ineffective because they don't read that carefully, or they don't have clear ideas of what good editing is. A typical error is to see, in this edition it was A, in this edition it was B, oh my God. And they leave out looking at the original manuscript to see what Prabhupada had said. So they have no way of finding out that actually the manuscript said B. That's sort of, and this, of course, is the sort of stuff that goes on Facebook and social media and what have you. But how did I get there? Oh, this. But so the main editor, the main people who police, as it were, or correct the editors are the translators. We have translators in Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, French, German, Indonesian, Spanish, dozens of languages, Russian, and those translators sit there and look at those words and meditate on them and ponder them and interrogate them and really inspect them. Prabhupada said the quality of an editor is that he should be scrutinizing. So these devotees really scrutinize, particularly if they're working with a language like Russian. They have to know what part of speech a word is. It's not enough to know that it's Krishna. Is it from Krishna, by Krishna, to Krishna, in Krishna, through Krishna? That we do all that with prepositions: in, to, from, of. But in Russian and other inflected languages, you do that with case endings, with the way that the words end. So they care about all that, which matters a lot in word-for-word meanings especially. But they inspect all these words. Many of these editors are reasonably conversant with Sanskrit also. And so they see something like in Bhagavad Gita, asat, falls, F-A-L-L-S. And they say, hold on, asat, falls? No. Asat is false. Asadityuchate parta. Asat means false. So then they send a memo to Dravida and say, what is this Asat false thing? This is Asat false. That's an error. And so the best police force, or the best inspectors, the most scrutinizing readers of the revised or less revised text are the translators. They're the ones who catch more errors than anyone else these days. And they're the ones also who, if something has been wrongly revised, most often catch the mistaken revision. So they're highly qualified people. To be a general reader is good, but to be a translator means you're really focused. Rup Sanatan here, he's our Dutch translator. So he has direct experience of what it's like. You really meditate on that text. You inspect and think about every word because you have to put it into your language. So in one sense, they're the best. They're the best source of guaranteeing, seeing to the integrity, as well as the general readership. It's not that only translators. Sometimes other readers catch errors or question revisions and bring up really valid points. So thoughtful readers can also contribute, and they do. They send their queries. It used to be to me, now it's to Dravida, and our policy is to answer them and sometimes to implement what they've found.
Maybe one more question. You said that at that time everyone was still in the beginning, still learning. I was wondering, how was it possible that someone was a Sanskrit expert at that time?
Well, we had Pradumna Prabhu. He was the only person who knew Sanskrit at that time, and he was new. He taught himself Sanskrit, went out and got the books. Actually, he began by transliterating. Prabhupada he wanted the books to be according to this scholarly standard with diacritical markings and so on. So Pradumna learned Devanagari and learned the system, and he was the one who was putting in the diacritic marks. But he didn't confine himself to diacritic marks. He learned Sanskrit and became an expert in Sanskrit to the point where when Prabhupada was leaving, it was Pradumna who was translating the commentaries and speaking them to Prabhupada so that Prabhupada could respond to them or comment according to what the Acharyas said. So that last chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, the last one Prabhupada did, is almost a collaboration, not almost, it's really a collaboration between Pradumna and Srila Prabhupada. And the other devotees in the room who were also asking questions, and Prabhupada would respond to them. It's a unique chapter. So this is an example, Dadami Buddhi Yogam Tam. Krishna says that if one is devoted, I give him the intelligence. Of course, Yena Mam Upayanti Te, by which they can come to me. But he also gives the intelligence by which they can do their service. When Lord Brahma wanted to create the universe, Krishna basically told him how to do it. And he similarly inspires or instructs other devotees. So that very often Prabhupada would tell devotees that there was no need of, university education or taking courses in this and that, but by doing the service, they would learn. We saw that in our book distribution. Nobody's really gone to marketing school, and yet we're distributing millions of books. And sometimes even people who are in marketing departments, they sit in the airport and watch our people and then make them offers, would you come work for us? By their enthusiasm, by their dedication. they find that Krishna reciprocates and teaches them what they need to know. So maybe in the beginning we make some mistakes, just like now they're rebuilding the Palace of Gold, because the original construction was not exactly according to all the standards, but the devotees had dedication, enthusiasm, and whatever shortcomings were there could be fixed later. So our whole movement has grown up like that. Now, of course, we have more people involved who are skilled professionals and experienced in various fields. But Prabhupada picked up people who, for the most part, had, Hayagriva was an exception, had little or no experience in what they were doing. Brahmananda had no experience in running a corporation or being the president of a temple. The devotees had no experience in deity worship, or no, they weren't experienced speakers, but Krishna helped. So ISKCON Press, later the BBT, got its start that way and largely continues that way by the efforts of sincere devotees who, you never went to translating school or anything like that. One course. But Rup Sanatan's an expert translator. He's also become an expert production manager and an expert publication designer. It's very fine taste in publication design. So all of these things, when we dedicate ourselves to the service of Krishna and the spiritual master, Krishna helps us. And the book department, publication department is one example of that. But throughout the society, you'll find devotees who just dedicated themselves to serving and got help from Krishna as needed. And still that's going on since the time of Brahma. Anything else?
Just something very short, Maharaj. I was wondering, so during this process, because Prabhupada was present, and when you had to go through the books and basically, seeing where are the mistakes and then working again on them, Srila Prabhupada, he was more putting focus on the books to go fast out, or everything should be done extremely carefully and attentively, or somewhere in between?
Well, he emphasized both things. To me, he said that an editor should be very scrutinizing. There's one famous letter where Prabhupada was reading one of the small books and found numerous errors. Prabhupada, I remember he made a sarcastic remark in the letter, "What is this Buddha Swa?" He said it's Bhuvar Swa, it's the Gayatri mantra, and everybody knows it. And there were similar, he said, "This is a very interesting word, neither Sanskrit nor English." How have such things passed by the eyes of so many editors undetected, So he wanted it, he said at one point, if there was even one mistake, it would murder the whole book. So he did want it to be carefully reviewed and carefully done so that it would be free of errors. But what I most often heard from him was speed. Especially since, we work at our pace and we turn it out. But for Prabhupada, he had an urgent mission. The world is waiting for these books. If we can't give them to it, give them the books. It's our fault. So he really, like for Bhagavad Gita as it is, those are the letters I got from Prabhupada. You said it would be ready by this time. Now you're saying it will be ready by that time. he wanted it fast. He wanted it fast. An early letter, he said, so, this many, one day for this, one day for this, one day for this, one day for this, and at the end of, a week, you have this. Now you've got these 10 pages, then another day, another day, another day, so 20 pages, and at the end of a month, you have one book like that. You're just doing the math, and just making it a mathematical question. If you do this many pages in this much time with this many people taking this many days, at the end of a month you have a book, and at the end of a year you have 12 books, and so on. So he wanted them fast. He wanted them fast. That was the main emphasis that I saw. He wanted them correct, and he did say that. He did instruct us that way, but particularly he wanted them fast. And the most prominent example was the marathon that he had us do for Chaitanya Charitamrita, where Prabhupada was ahead in his dictation. We were how many books behind? 17? I think 17 books. All of Madhya Lila, all of Antya Lila, maybe one volume of Adi Lila, plus 2 volumes of 5th canto. He dictated all of that, and it was all somewhere in production. So we left behind when Prabhupada was doing, at that point, we'd shifted to Los Angeles from New York, and shortly before we'd acquired a new typesetting system. We'd gotten rid of the IBM machines and traded them in for what was then the leading edge technology, phototypesetting, which involved big computerized machines, expensive machines that produced typeset copy on photographic paper, which you would then send through a big, monstrous developing machine. And then that would be your typeset galleys, which you would then paste up and so on. But of course, it went much faster. So when we moved to Los Angeles, Prabhupada came and toured the press and saw all this fancy equipment. He said, in India, I was dreaming about something like this. And then on his morning walk the next day, he said, basically, I'm 17 books ahead of you. I think you can do these 17 books in 2 months. And we were doing 1 book in 2 months. And we thought we were doing good. We thought we were doing very well with a book every 2 months, carefully done and good standard. He wants 17 books in 2 months. So at that rate, you're not going to be quite as scrutinizing, but he wanted them fast. I think he said, in fact, maybe it was remembered, if there are mistakes, we can fix them later. Chaitanya Charitamrita. Even on the paintings, they were tearing the paintings out of the artist's hands, banging down the doors, your deadline is over. There's a painting of Rukmini fanning, perhaps it's Sudama Brahmana, and the chamara has no handle.
So,
Better? Prabhupada said that his books will be the law books for the next 10,000 years. But we can see that language changes relatively quickly. I mean, we can look at first edition books. You mentioned Shakespeare, and there's so many others from that age. Can't be understood by modern English speakers.
Yeah, Chaucer would probably be a better example. Shakespeare's at least intelligible to an ordinary educated person. Chaucer, you need special education.
But as far as translating, I mean, we're not really speaking Sanskrit, and less people in the university and in traditional education are studying the original languages, Sanskrit or Latin or whatever it may be, and language is evolving increasingly quick. All languages, not just English, but you can look at first edition books from 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 600 years ago.
So we're coming to the point where English will no longer be, the 20th century English will no longer be intelligible to a modern reader of the future. So BBT will have to deal with that. Fortunately, I won't be here to be criticized for whatever decisions they take.
But has anyone ever thought about this?
Yes, it's been a known issue for a long time.
I mean, just in my short years, I'm less than a century old. And
Yeah, if you look at what's happened to a word like gay, for example, one commentator said, "Weep for gay." The word is lost. Used to mean happy, carefree. The word is gone. It has an entirely different meaning today. So that will happen. And of course, the future generations will have to see how fast it happens and to what extent the books are still intelligible. The original 20th century books will still be presumably available somewhere.
Just like some of those classics, they're collector's editions, but only the most elite educated people can really understand the meaning of the author of those first edition books.
Yeah. And partly it's the fault of the educational system. People are becoming increasingly illiterate. But that's another, in any case, as far as to avoid a sort of broad-ranging question, the BBT or whoever's responsible for publishing in the future will have to deal with that and say, what do we do? Prabhupada's books should be read by the greatest number of people. They should be understandable. They should be accessible. They should be, law books in everyone's hand. But it's difficult because they're in a language that nobody speaks anymore, or a language that doesn't mean what it used to mean. Even my book, Vanity Karma, vanity doesn't really mean for most people what it meant when that word was used in the King James Version of the Bible. It used to mean nothingness, meaninglessness, vanity. He worked in vain. Now, vain means proud, and vanity means pride, as a primary meaning. So all of these things, biblical translators have dealt with. Shakespeare's publishers have dealt with. Publishers of other old authors have dealt with. And so Prabhupada's publishers will have to deal with it.
Thank you, Maharaj.
We have now more than reached the end of our time, so we can have a little kirtan. And perhaps tomorrow we'll start the actual reading or resume our actual reading of Krishna book. But I hope you found this historical session worthwhile. And thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.